Welcome everyone. Our group A&M has created this video and presentation to assess the productivity in sub-Saharan Africa. In doing so, we're going to use chapters 1, 2, and 4 from Boosting Productivity in Sub-Saharan Africa, Policies and Institutions to Promote Efficiency by Cesar Calderon. Ours is definitely not the most sophisticated analysis due to the use of small research. However, we attempt to generate an analysis using macroeconomic theories to provide a simple overview of the policies in the region. Starting off with the current scenario of sub-Saharan Africa, it's clear that the productivity and output of work of the region lags when compared to other high-income countries. For example, the graph on the left shows that although the disparity in output per worker compared to the USA in absolute terms has decreased, it has shown an increasing trend in the past few years. However, the important point comes from what comprises the disparities. The graph shows that low TFP is almost 70% responsible for these disparities. TFP is one, this is concerning because TFP is one differentiates two countries with the same labor and capital. Now, coming to why the TFP is so low, there are three reasons for this. First, high employment in agriculture with low economic activity, which has led to the misallocation of resources. Second, which is the preferential trade policy, which led to volatile export. And the COVID-19, which has led to the Keynesian supply shock. These three in combination have majorly contributed to the reduced TFP. Not only that, but in the aspirational development benchmark, sub-Saharan African countries lag when compared to the EAPF 5 countries, as they are 3 times more productive, even when the region has had a head start in the 1960s. This is because of the differences in the pace of capital accumulation and a growing divergence in the TFP between the two regions. In addressing this lag of TFP, to increase productivity at firm level, we utilize 3 components. First is the within component, which means changes in the way inputs are used in production to increase efficiency. Second is the between component, which implies that the most productive firms would command the most resources, thus rendering the largest output and productivity gains. And third is selection component, which accounts for the gains arising from the entry of high-level firms and the exit of low productivity firms. In addressing these components, the productivity, which is A star T in the equation, which is also the TFP, increases. The aggregate TFP is influenced by the 3 components as mentioned above, and also the Y star T increases, which is the output of the worker, and the increase in the Y star T increases the productivity.
So while this was the productivity growth that the report considers important, we can benchmark the productivity of sub-Saharan Africa through observations on change in GDP, TFP, production rates at the unit level, efficiency and development benchmark statistics, and the efficient allocation of resources. Sub-Saharan African GDP grew rapidly from 4.8% from 1980 to 2014, even growing during 2008 when high-income countries were struggling. When accounting for population growth, real GDP per capita grew at an annual average rate of 1.95% from 1996 through 2014. Looking at the global efficiency benchmark, output per worker in sub-Saharan Africa relative to that of the United States declined 4%, decreasing productivity in sub-Saharan Africa. The global development benchmark shows the contrasting evolution of labor productivity in sub-Saharan Africa, indicating differences in the pace of human and physical capital accumulation. The efficient allocation in this economy maximizes final output and is characterized by 2 decisions. A, the number of operating establishments, and B, the allocation of capital and labor across the operating establishments. So how do we measure the evolution of productivity over time? Are there any problems with this data? So we observe the trends in growth and output on a local, regional, and national basis to measure the evolution of productivity over time. When looking at the data, we need to consider 3 levels of data: aggregate, sectoral, and establishment. A large issue in measuring productivity in sub-Saharan Africa comes from poor and inconsistent data, coupled with unreliable estimates that do not always accurately account for total GDP. Within larger nations, there is often a larger informal sector, which leads to inaccurate macro and structural data. At the national level in some countries, standards are not adhered to, so comparison is not always viable. Also, data may sometimes lag due to natural volatility in output in agriculture, which is often affected by domestic shocks and variable commodity prices. In 2010, Ghana revised GDP to 44.8 billion, 63% higher than before, as it included data on unmeasured parts in the economy.
Development accounting is the manipulation of a production function to examine whether cross-country income differences arise from differences in total factor productivity or due to factor accumulation. With this information, we can correctly inform policy decisions and let developing countries know if they need to increase the quantity and quality of factors of production or increase efficiency by technological adoption. So the slide shows that from 1960s to the mid-1980s, more than half of the differences in output per worker between sub-Saharan Africa and the United States were driven by differences in the relative endowment of physical and human capital and undercapitalization. However, since the 1990s, differences in TFP became the main driver explaining the output per worker gaps. So over time, TFP differences have played a larger role in explaining the gap, and this could be attributed to primarily resource misallocation. Overall, the reasons for these productivity gaps have shifted from an undercapitalization story to more of a production inefficiency story. So finally, the region's scarce physical and human capital, compounded by misallocation of these resources, translates into an even lower level of labor and total factor productivity. Next, what's the role of structural transformation in the sub-Saharan countries? As labor and other resources move from agriculture into modern economic activities, overall productivity rises and incomes expand. The speed with which this transformation takes place is the key factor that differentiates successful countries from unsuccessful ones. Sub-Saharan countries have been unsuccessful due to their substantial lag in structural transformation for two main reasons. Firstly, a large share of people still work and make a living from agricultural activities. And secondly, the region's employment share in agriculture has been declining more slowly in comparison to other countries. This is evidently shown in this slide.
There are three main channels that are associated with the loss of aggregate productivity. These are 1. The technology channel. Technology consists specifically of how efficiently the input is transferred to output. For example, if policies introduce new unskilled farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, unaware of which crops work at the right climate conditions, then that is representative of a decrease in the technology aspect of productivity. The misallocation channel. Think about a firm in Ethiopia with capital and labor as inputs. Assuming a Cobb-Douglas production function, the red curve represents 2 units produced and the black curve is when 1 unit is produced. The green curve is the constraint of resources. We can see that the allocation of 2 units of labor and capital each yields a greater output than the allocation 0.25, 3.75. This shows that the total number of inputs can be the same, but policies that restrict the number of particular types can lead to a less productive allocation of resources. Finally, the selection channel. For example, imagine that there are 2 separate sectors, firms and farms. If a country taxes work in firms, then naturally those firms will hire less workers, some of whom may be skilled enough to move to the farm sector, thus increasing farm output, decreasing firm output. Since ZA representing agricultural productivity tends to be less than ZF representing firm productivity, the changes in Y or output will actually decrease aggregate productivity. This exemplifies how changes in output due to changes in the number and distribution of operating processes can impact aggregate productivity.
While the report mentions a number of policies related to aggregate productivity losses, in this presentation we're going to focus on 3 main ones, namely trade policies that support prioritized subsectors or regions, inadequate infrastructure investment, and financial frictions. The trade policies that support prioritized subsectors or regions can lead to the entry or survival of inefficient firms, thereby lowering aggregate productivity. For example, in Ethiopia, domestic firms targeted by import substitution policies tended to have lower TFP than non-targeted firms. Inadequate infrastructure investment. Sub-Saharan Africa ranks at the bottom of all low and middle income regions in virtually all dimensions of infrastructure performance. Inadequate transportation infrastructure adds 30 to 40% to the cost of goods traded among African countries. Poor and underdeveloped transportation infrastructure limits accessibility to consumers, hampers inter-regional trade, and drives up import and export costs. It also raises the logistical and transaction costs and reduces competitiveness. Insufficient and unreliable availability of electric power is also one of the biggest challenges facing African firms. It affects firms' performance through the reduction of firm-level investments. At the intensive margin, financial frictions distort the allocation of capital, lowering TFP. At the extensive margin, financial frictions lead to the misallocation of talent and distort the number of productivity units for a given distribution of entrepreneurial talent in an economy. The financial frictions can lower the number of entrepreneurs, which reduces the number of people producing ideas, which reduces TFP growth. The simplified version of the Roma model that we studied in the course assumes that the number of workers producing ideas remain constant, leading to a constant growth rate of knowledge, which in turn leads to a constant increase in the GDP per capita. Moreover, the model does not consider the quality of workers producing ideas, especially in this case where there's a misallocation of talent. Therefore, the model fails to interpret the sub-Saharan African country situation. Furthermore, financial frictions may lead to poverty traps by distorting the entry decision of entrepreneurs.